Welcome to the video on the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is the key to unlocking full potential of your camera and capturing stunning images. In this video, we'll demystify the technical jargon and break down the three components of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Get your cameras ready because by the end of this video, you will be a pro at mastering the perfect exposure. Alright, let's get into understanding the exposure triangle, and we start with ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and it refers to the camera sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO value, the more sensitive the camera is to light, and the brighter the image will be. The lower the ISO value, the less sensitive the camera is to light, and the darker the image will be. When you are adjusting the ISO, you are essentially adjusting the camera sensitivity to light. This means that you can use a higher ISO value in low light situations and a lower ISO value in bright light situations. It's important to keep in mind that as you increase the ISO value, you may also increase the amount of noise or grain in the image. This is why it's important to find the right balance between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture when adjusting the exposure of an image. When using ISO, it's also important to consider the lighting conditions in which you are shooting. Generally, you will want to use the lowest ISO value possible in order to get the best image quality. But in low light situations, you may need to use a higher ISO value to get a properly exposed image. In conclusion, ISO is an important element of the exposure triangle and it plays a crucial role in determining the final image. We move on to the second corner of the exposure triangle, shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to the amount of time the camera shutter is open when taking a photograph. The longer the shutter is open, the more light enters the camera and the brighter the image will be. The shorter the shutter is open, the less light enters the camera and the darker the image will be. Shutter speed also plays a critical role in capturing movement in an image. A fast shutter speed will freeze movement and create a sharp image, while a slow shutter speed will create a sense of motion blur and can be used to create a sense of movement and motion in an image. For example, if you are shooting a sports game, you will want to use a fast shutter speed to freeze the action and create sharp images. On the other hand, if you are shooting a waterfall, you will want to use a slow shutter speed to create a sense of movement and motion in the image. It's important to keep in mind that when using a slow shutter speed, it's essential to use a tripod or some other form of support to steady the camera, as even the slightest movement can cause camera shake and blur the image. In conclusion, shutter speed is an important element of the exposure triangle and it plays a critical role in determining the final image. We are on to our last corner of the exposure triangle, aperture. Aperture refers to the size of the camera's opening of the lens, which controls the amount of light that enters the camera. The aperture is measured in f-stops, and the lower the f-stop number, the larger the aperture, and the more light that enters the camera. The higher the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture, and the less light enters the camera. Aperture also plays a critical role in depth of field, which refers to how much of the image is in focus. A larger aperture or a lower f-stop number will result in a shallow depth of field, which means that only a small portion of the image is in focus, while a smaller aperture or a higher f-stop number will result in a deeper depth of field, which means that more of the image is in focus. Let's take a look at an example of how aperture affects the exposure of an image. In this image, the aperture is set to f1.8, resulting in a shallow depth of field and a well-exposed subject. The background is blurred, making the subject stand out more. In this image, the aperture is set to f11. The depth of field is much deeper, and the background is more in focus. However, the exposure is not as good as in the first example because the aperture is smaller and less light is entering the camera. When should we use different aperture settings? If you want to isolate your subject and make them stand out against a blur background, use a larger aperture or a lower f-stop number. If you want a deep depth of field where the background is also in focus, use a smaller aperture or a higher f-stop number. If you are shooting in low light, use a larger aperture, lower f-stop number to let more light in. Here are some tips for using aperture to improve the exposure of an image. If you are shooting in low light, use a larger aperture or a lower f-stop number to let in more light. If you want to isolate your subject and make them stand out against a blurred background, use a larger aperture number. Experiment with different aperture settings to find the perfect balance between depth of field and exposure. Use a tripod to steady your camera if you are using a smaller aperture to avoid camera shake. Thank you for watching our video on the exposure triangle. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more photography tips and tricks. We hope you have a better understanding of the three main camera settings: aperture, shutter speed and ISO, and how they work together to control the exposure of an image. Remember that the exposure triangle is not a set of rules but a tool to help you understand how to control the exposure of the images and create the effects you desire. Experiment with different settings and don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn and grow as photographers. Keep practicing and experimenting, and don't forget to have fun with it. Happy shooting!